Hey all, and welcome back to Fuzzy Ducksy Gaming. Now this is an attempt at a tank guide for Neverwinter. Now I've got to confess, tank is fairly new to me, so there might be aspects that I'm missing, so feel free to mention it in the comments. But a few people have asked me to give like a tips video on how to build a tank and what to do to be successful. So it's really a guide for people who want to try and build a tank for the first time. I don't think it's going to help people that are experienced tanks because you probably know more than me. So we're going to talk through the basic things to be wary of when building a tank, along with companions, insignia bonuses, and gear that can help you on your way to success. So firstly, we're going to look at the fundamentals of tanking, starting with threat. The threat is a metric used to determine who an enemy is going to target amongst your group. So characters generate threat by either dealing damage to enemies or healing allies. Tanks also have quite a few abilities where they're able to generate threat. So the player who holds the most threat against an enemy is signalled by a red bar next to the player. So as I attack this dummy, if you look at the top left of the screen, you'll see that there's a red bar. That means I am the main target that that enemy is going to hit. So if this bar is green, it means you're way down on the threat list. As it goes to yellow and orange, it means you're getting closer to the top. So as a tank, we have a mechanic that's named differently depending on your class, but it does the same thing. So if we go into my character here, so for Barbarian, it's called Will of the Sentinel, and it says increases threat generated, increases maximum hit points by 40%, and decreases damage dealt by 10%. So we're not going to be doing the same damage as a DPS class would if you had the same encounters, but we are generating more threat. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't say how much more threat, so we're just going to have to assume that it's probably 10% to balance out, but we don't know. It's noticeable as well. When you play, you'll notice, and I've certainly noticed, it's much easier to get threat and hold it than it is to try and take threat off of another character. So due to this, we need to make sure we're engaging mobs before DPS. So to do this, always recommend that you slot an encounter, which is one that I call a gap closer. So every tank class has one, and it's basically an encounter that we can use from a long range that repels us quickly towards the target. We also want to use any at-wills that we can slot that give us increased threat or increased threat generation. So if we look at my character here, my gap closer would be Punishing Charge. It has a range of 60 feet and it basically lunges at target enemy and deals a decent amount of damage. I then slot Challenger Slash, which gives me increased threat, and then I will slot at least one encounter here that gives me an AoE to damage enemies. If you can get any sort of rotation like this off before DPS engage enemies, you should have no problem at all holding threat as long as you've built your tank properly. So an example for me on this, I would use my Punishing Charge from a distance. I would then use my threat generation at will. I would then use my AoE and then I would hit whatever enemy is closest to me with my biggest power. And that should be enough to hold threat for quite a long time. Even if you have got some really strong DPS in the party, if you can get in there first, get a rotation off, get some increased threat going, it's really, really easy to hold aggro. And then when you slot your powers, if you're using these at-wills that give you increased threat or increased threat generation in between encounters, that's normally enough to hold aggro. So I find the rotation is actually not as important as actually getting to the mobs first, and that should be your priority. So even if slotting your gap closer means you have to drop a power that might have a really high magnitude or it might have increased threat generation, that's no good if you don't get to the target first. So what I tend to do, if I'm running with a group and I'm on microphone, then obviously I can just say, let me get there first. Majority of the time I'm not, so I have to basically make sure I'm there first. So what I'll tend to do is I'll launch at the target and then I'll use whatever encounters I've got. And then in a case where I can, I'll then move behind the target, so that means all the DPS don't have to reposition to get combat advantage. They just literally need to walk straight up to the enemies and start unloading on them. And that's what I'll try and do with every group of enemies and every boss. So that covers threat generation in a nutshell. So we'll now move on to blocking, which is our left thumbstick or shift mechanic if you're on PC. I think it's shift or it could be tab. I haven't played on PC for a while. And that's basically our block. Now our block is basically our stamina, and if you're holding block and you get hit, you can't lose health, you can only lose stamina, and the amount of stamina you have is determined by the amount of hit points you have. your shield is basically half of your hit points. So if we look at my character here, so I've got 546,000 hit points, so I will have around 275,000 shield, and that's how much damage I can take before it breaks. Now, depending on what class you are and what style you play, you may use block all the time, you may not use it much. It's really dependent on your play style and the character that you're playing. But you will find that if you get in first with an opening salvo, getting a combo going, get some increased threat, you can actually block for quite a long time, and a lot of the time you can block until your encounters come back. You just have to keep an eye on not only your threat, but also the threat of your allies as well. If you can see that someone's threat is starting to go yellow or orange, then you need to start attacking to push yourself further up that threat list. Now, I don't use any encounters that automatically place me on the top of a threat list, but the tank classes do have them. So if you don't have a particularly high power and you are struggling to keep aggro with your normal attacks, then you can slot these encounters, and it just means that, let's say it's a 15-second cooldown, that every 15 seconds, even if you don't have threat, you can use that encounter and you can get the threat back off an enemy. Now, there is lots you can go into in block, but I'm not going to, because it is really class dependent. Now, there's plenty of good builds out there for different tanks. I've got one for the Barbarian. It's the only one I really run as a tank build, so I don't want to go advising people on either Fighter or Paladin because I don't play those classes. But there's decent builds out there that you can find that will give you the gist of how the mechanics for a particular class works. So we'll move on from block, and then what we'll move on to now is the stats you want to aim for your tank. It's fairly simple. As a tank, you obviously want to be taking most of the damage. If you're taking loads of damage, it means you want to cap your defensive stats. So if we're just looking at the maximum in mod 16 at the moment, you need 68,000 to do Lair of the Mad Mage in terms of capping your stats. So that would be defense, it would be crit avoidance, it would be deflect, and it would be awareness. Now, it is actually really difficult to cap all of these. So what you need to do is look at what's a priority. Now, for me as a tank, defense is obviously the most important because it limits the damage you receive from every attack up to 50%. So my defense is 74k, so I know I can mitigate 50% of all the damage that's thrown at me. The next most important is deflect. Again, I'm at the cap, and what this means is I have a 50% chance to deflect every attack that comes my way. And what deflect does is basically reduces the damage that you receive from that attack by 50%. Now, there are extra reasons why deflect is really important, and it gets linked into mount Insignia bonuses, which we'll come to later. Awareness, which counts as combat advantage, is pretty important as well because it reduces the amount of combat advantage damage you receive. So the higher you can get this to 68k, the less combat advantage damage you're going to receive. But you can also avoid combat advantage damage altogether by positioning yourself correctly. Against bosses, for example, if there's only one enemy, you're not going to receive any combat advantage damage. Also, in mobs, you want to be trying to position yourself so that all the mobs are a certain side of you. So again, you can avoid combat advantage damage without having to build into awareness. So that covers off the defensive stats, but it is also important to have high offensive stats where you can. Obviously, the higher item level you get, the more gear you get, the better your enchants, companions, etc., the more you can invest into the offensive side of things. So if you're just starting out, the two things you really want to aim for is armor pen and accuracy, because that means that you're not going to get any hits deflected, and you're not going to have any damage mitigated by their defense. So if you can get both of these to 68k, that's a good place to start. You then can look at critical strike, hit the 50% cap there so that you know every 1 in 2 hits it's critting, and then it's just boosting power as you can. Now, these are important stats because you'll find if you don't invest in your offensive stats, you won't have enough powers that give you automatic threat generation to keep and hold threat, even if you get in there first. So you need to make sure you're at least capping the ones like armor pen and accuracy as explained, so that you're not getting any of your damage mitigated. So that covers off stats in a nutshell. You don't really need to go into much more detail than that. You obviously want to hit every cap where you can, but defense-wise, it's difficult. Now, I go with crit avoidance as the one I don't aim for. There's no particular reason for it. The only reason at the moment is because we're in mod 16. The defensive item that you get on your companion is defense and awareness. So that's the only reason. If that came with crit avoidance, I would have crit avoidance instead of awareness. It's purely because that's built into that item that we have that. So we're now going to look at mounts and insignia bonuses. So really quickly, we'll start with mounts. For your equip power, if you've capped your stats like deflect, armor panel, that sort of thing, you either want to be going hit points or power. Personally, I think you get more benefit out of hit points, but it's totally up to you. And with your mount combat power, it's whatever you've got to slot, really. So moving on to the actual insignia bonuses. These are the ones I run. You might want to run things differently, but the way I'll build my tank is for maximum durability and maximum self-healing. So all my 5 insignia bonuses give me heals over time of some sort. So I'll run Survivor's Blessing, which is when you deflect an attack, you receive hit points over time. It says 1% over 5 seconds, but it's actually 5% over 5 seconds. This comes in handy massively because I mentioned before you want to cap your deflect. If you run Survivor's Blessing, basically every other hit on average that you receive, you're going to deflect, and that gives you a heal over time. So I do run 2 of them, and it's just important to say that when you run 2 of the same bonus, the second one basically has half the effectiveness. So the first one gives me 1%, the second gives me 0.5%. So when I deflect an attack, I'll get 1.5% heals every second. Same with Barbarian's Revelry. I run 2 of these, and basically every time I crit, I receive a 1.5% heal over time. This is ideal for the Barbarian tank because they very rarely block if you play this character properly. If you're playing a tank that needs to block a lot, you might consider running something like Knight's Rebuke for heals when you receive combat advantage damage. You could run Gladiator's Guile for the extra speed. There's a few different ones that you can look at. As I say, these are the ones I run, and I find that they work really, really well. So you'll see, I won't put it in here, but if you go to my Barbarian tank build, I do a demonstration of why these combinations work really well, and there's footage of me going through Lair of the Mad Mage, just base tanking all the mobs in there, and basically staying almost at full health for the whole time without using health potions. In terms of the actual insignias you slot, I personally would go for Prosperity and Dominance because hit points and power are really, really important. So the last thing to cover off that in regard to insignia bonuses that kind of combines with them is your hit points. Now, block and insignia bonuses change depending on your hit points. So the more hit points you have, the more heals over time you're going to get because all our healing from our insignia bonuses is percentage based. And also the more health we have, the bigger our shield is. So I would recommend where you can that you stack HP. So that would be wearing as higher item level gear as you can that's decent because the higher the item level, the more hit points you get. Mount. Here I've got the Triceratops, which is 50k hit points. You can get the purple one, which is fairly cheap and gives you 25k. Again, Prosperity Insignias will help. You can get companion bonuses, all sorts of things to boost your HP up. Now mine's not massive, mine's 545 when I don't have any potions, but when I'm all stacked up it's over 600k. Because of that, I would 100% recommend you running tactical enchantments in all your utility slots. Now on console we're still in mod 16, these are getting halved in mod 17, so as you can see my rank 14 tactical in my helmet gives me 11% income and healing. In mod 17 that's going to be 5.5%. But as it's a massively important stat for a tank, I'm still going to slot these tacticals and I recommend that you would as well. So if we quickly look at companions, I'm not going to go through them in too much detail. The only one I would say that you should definitely take is Shadow Demon. Slots in your utility power. Now the reason I say to slot this is its power is that basically when you deflect an attack, it does minimal damage. And when I say minimal, it's less than 10 damage. So basically, we've capped our deflect, which at 50% means we're deflecting every other attack. With this Shadow Demon power, we don't take any damage when we deflect an attack. It is literally less than 10 damage that we receive. And we're using our insignia bonuses that procs off of deflection. So we're going to receive about 7 damage from deflecting, and at the same time we're going to proc those healing insignia bonuses. The rest of them are all up to you. I kind of had to change mine around a lot because at the beginning I was low on deflect, So I had to run a few companions to top that off. Then as I got my deflect up through my gear, I then started adding in ones that had power, hit points and incoming healing. And they're the ones that I recommend you aim for. Again, as with any other character, you want a legendary augment to maximize your stats. You're going to find it really difficult to cap all your stats without an augment and certainly without a legendary one. So we'll now quickly look at boons. I'm not going to go through everything. I would just say on your campaign boons, as with most or every other build, take power and hit points for every single tier. Take movement speed, take companion influence. For tier 5, you've got two ways you can go. I go incoming healing and crit severity, but you could add in extra stamina regeneration, although I don't find that 3 or 4% does a massive amount, but it might be one you want to consider slotting. Master Boons is really going to depend on the ones you like because they are very different. I go with enhanced application just as almost a backup plan if I start to get low on health, which is a rare occasion. But basically this one means when I use an at will, for the following 10 seconds after I use it, if my health is below 30%, I can either add a self-heal to my attack, I can add a heal over time effect, or I can reduce the damage of the next attack by 10% per rank. So it is handy, doesn't proc very often because I'm often above 30% health, but it's a good backup plan. And then for your campaigns, for your stronghold, you just want to take power and hit points. So we'll now move on to the last thing, which would be enchantments, gear and artifacts. So for gear, you basically want to be taking as higher item level as you can because you get more hit points for that. But more importantly, look for stuff that boosts damage, power, hit points or combat advantage. For your weapon enchantment, I'd still recommend the Vorpal just because of the crit severity it gives you means you cause more damage, which gives you more threat. For defense, you've got a few options, but I personally run Elven. You're more resistant to slows, immobilizes and disables. Apparently, I don't actually notice much of a difference. The reason I'm running it is more for the stamina regen. So I've only got a rank 11 and my stamina regen is increased by 30%. And I do notice that. In terms of my artifacts, I'm running Staff of Flowers because of the utility boost that it gives the team. So allies gain 5k power. It also slows foes and it deals a decent amount of damage. But really you want to be looking for anything that either causes a high amount of damage because it helps with threat generation, or maybe something that gives you healing. Either of those will be fine, and there's loads of different artifacts that can offer that. Now one ring I would look at, and there's a few different ones, but you want to try and look for this particular ring comes from Cholt Hunts, and it gives you crit avoidance and deflection and 2 offensive slots, which is I need to cap my deflection, and it helps me get my crit avoidance up a little bit. So as you can see on my deflection, I'm just over the 68k cap when I'm in the dungeon. So if I wasn't running that ring, I wouldn't be hitting that cap. So you may want to look for these rings. There's other different ones. I think there's a dual offense one that drops in Tomb of Nine Gods, and there's a few different ones that you can get that offer deflection and crit severity. So that covers off tanking in a fairly large nutshell. I don't want to go into any more detail. I could go on for sort of hours on like different little bits and bobs for different classes, but this is more built for newer players and I don't want to overwhelm them. So we'll just do a really quick summary before we wrap the video up. So first and foremost, when you're tanking, get to enemies first, using counters that generate or increase threat where you can, and keep an eye on threat meters. If you'll get into groups first and unleashing all your encounters, that's going to be enough to keep the threat. And then you're free to block if you need to. You should still fairly comfortably be able to manage that threat. Also, in terms of stats, cap deflect and defense as priorities, along with armor pen and accuracy. Push your HP as far as you can to utilize your healing and Insignia bonuses, but be wary and maybe slot tactical enchantments to help your healer out. And lastly, use your enchants, your companions and your insignias to balance your stats as needed. Now, there's probably stuff I haven't covered, or there might be stuff you're unsure of. Feel free to leave comments or questions and I'll certainly get back to you. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.